The auctioneer's gavel had barely risen before Luke Boone realized that the worst night of his life was about to get considerably stranger. He stood on the wooden stage outside Callaway's saloon in Dusk Creek, Texas, in the blazing summer of 1882, his wrists loosely bound in front of him with a length of rough rope, his hat gone, his dark hair falling across his forehead in a way that might have looked rakish under better circumstances. Around him, the town of Dusk Creek carried on its Saturday afternoon business with the detached curiosity of people who had seen odder things and fully expected to see odder things still. A group of ranch hands leaned against the hitching post, sharing a bottle and grinning. 3 women from the church circle stood at a safe distance, fanning themselves and whispering. A boy of about 10 sat on a barrel eating a peach and staring at Luke with the open, unashamed fascination that only children and vultures can manage. Harlan Callaway himself stood at the edge of the stage, thumbs hooked in his suspenders, his face the deep reddish purple of a man who had been wronged and intended for everyone within 3 counties to know it. He was a broad, square man, not tall, but solid in the way of someone who had once been strong and now carried that former strength as fat. He wore a brocade vest that had seen better decades and a mustache that had not been trimmed since the previous administration. $42.30, Callaway announced to the assembled crowd, his voice pitched for carrying. That is the debt this man owes my establishment. $42.30 in whiskey, poker losses, and 1 broken mirror that I have generously reduced from its actual replacement cost. He paused to let the generosity of that last detail sink in. Since he has no funds, no horse, and apparently no friends willing to loan him so much as a dime, I have obtained the blessing of Deputy Hicks to conduct a legal labor auction. Whoever pays the debt gets 30 days of this man's work. 30 days. He is reportedly able-bodied, though I confess I have seen limited evidence of it. There was laughter from the ranch hands. Luke stared at a point somewhere above the general horizon and said nothing, because there was truly nothing useful to say. He had arrived in Dusk Creek 3 weeks ago with $60 in his pocket, a letter of introduction to a ranching outfit that had turned out to be defunct, and the particular brand of optimism that had served him poorly his entire life. The $60 had lasted about as well as $60 tended to last when a man was lonely, and the cards seemed friendly for the first 4 hands. He was 28 years old. He was broad-shouldered and lean-hipped, and his hands were calloused from years of honest work that he kept failing to sustain. He had grown up outside of Abilene on a small cattle operation that his father had run into the ground with patience and dedication, and since leaving home at 18, he had worked cattle drives, fence lines, mining operations, a brief and terrible experiment in carpentry, and 1 extremely confusing month as a telegraph operator before it became clear that his relationship with Morse code was not going to develop into anything meaningful. None of that history was visible to the crowd in Dusk Creek. What they saw was a tall man with dark eyes and a jaw that needed a razor, standing on a stage with his wrists tied, looking like he was attending a funeral that happened to be his own. "Now then," Callaway said, rubbing his hands together, "who will start the bidding? $42.30 buys you 30 days of labor from a reasonably young man. Who opens?" Silence. Not the brief, considering silence of people thinking. The long, flat silence of people who have already thought and reached their conclusion. The ranch hands exchanged looks. A couple of them might have had the money, but taking on a man whose primary skill seemed to be losing at cards was not an obvious investment. The church women were not in the market. The boy with the peach watched with interest but lacked both funds and, presumably, the need for 30 days of labor. Luke counted 17 people in his immediate eyeline, and not one of them was raising a hand. Callaway's face cycled through several emotions. He had been certain this would work. He had been certain since the idea had come to him at 3 in the morning 2 days ago that it was a sound plan, legally adjacent enough to pass muster with the deputy, and that someone in Dust Creek would pay $42 to have a man at their disposal for a month. He had been wrong about things before. He had not expected to be wrong about this. $42, he said again, slightly louder. Any takers? He can ride, he can do ranch work. He is not unintelligent when sober, and I am told his carpentry is passable. This last part was an invention, but Calloway felt it was a reasonable one. Still nothing. Luke was beginning to calculate whether he could get the rope off his wrists before Calloway noticed, and whether it would be better to run east or west when a voice came from the back of the gathered crowd. $42.30. It was a woman's voice, clear, practical, unhurried. The voice of someone accustomed to being heard without having to raise their pitch. The crowd turned. Luke turned. She was standing at the edge of the gathering near a dusty wagon hitched to a gray mare that had clearly been ridden hard, and was communicating its opinions about this through a series of pointed ear movements. The woman herself was perhaps 30 years old, possibly less, possibly more, with the kind of face that the sun had made honest and angular. She was wearing a calico dress that had been washed so many times the original color was a matter of interpretation, a pair of boots that had been resoled at least once, and a wide-brimmed hat that she took off now as she moved through the crowd, revealing dark auburn hair pinned back in a practical knot. She was not soft, and she was not frail, and she was not, from the look of her, the kind of woman who made decisions she intended to revisit. She reached the front of the crowd and looked up at Luke with brown eyes that assessed him the way a farmer assesses a new tool, checking for obvious defects, considering the probable use. "I said $42.30, she repeated, looking at Calloway now. "That is the debt, is it not? I am not paying a cent more." Calloway blinked. He had not anticipated this development, but money was money, and the woman was already reaching into a small leather purse. "And you are," he said. "Martha Abbott," she said. "I have a homestead 4 miles south. I need a fence fixed." She counted out bills and coins with the focused speed of someone who found all of this mildly inconvenient but had calculated that it was the most efficient solution available. She held the money out to Calloway without ceremony. 30 days. That is what the arrangement is. "That is what the arrangement is," Calloway confirmed, taking the money and counting it again because he was that kind of man. Martha Abbott turned and looked up at Luke Boone, who was still standing on the stage with his wrists tied, and said, in a tone of complete neutrality, "Can you fix a fence?" Luke looked at her for a moment. He was aware that he should feel grateful. He was aware that he should feel relieved. What he mostly felt was the particular complicated embarrassment of a man who has just been purchased by a woman for the price of a broken mirror and several weeks of bad decisions. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Good," she said. She looked at his wrists. "Calloway, take the rope off him. He is not a criminal, he is a debtor. There is a difference." Calloway looked as though he wanted to argue this point, but something in Martha Abbott's expression suggested that the argument would not go well for him, and he nodded at Deputy Hicks, who climbed up and cut the rope. Luke stepped down from the stage. Martha was already walking back toward her wagon. He followed, rubbing his wrists, and when he came alongside the wagon she pointed at the back of it without looking at him. "You can ride back there," she said. "It is 4 miles. I will explain the work when we get there." He climbed into the wagon bed, which contained 2 sacks of flour, a box of nails, 3 fence posts, and a look of general hard use. Martha climbed to the driver's bench, took the reins, and clicked her tongue at the gray mare, who moved out with the resigned dignity of a horse that had long since accepted its fate. As the wagon rolled out of Dust Creek, Luke looked back at the crowd outside Calloway's saloon. The boy with the peach gave him a small wave. Luke nodded back. Well, he thought, at least he would be doing something useful. The 4 miles to the Abbott homestead moved through country that was beautiful in a demanding sort of way, the kind of landscape that asked something of you before it gave anything back. The land was wide and dry and golden, crossed by dry creek beds that suggested water in other seasons, dotted with mesquite and the occasional outcropping of red limestone. The sky was enormous. In 1882, much of this land was still open range. Though the fences were coming, the railroads were dividing what the cattle outfits had treated as their own for decades, and the small homesteaders were holding on by the skin of their teeth against ranching interests that would have preferred they not exist at all. Martha Abbott drove without conversation, which gave Luke time to observe her hands on the reins and conclude that she knew what she was doing with a horse, and to notice the set of her shoulders, which communicated a kind of determined calm that he recognized from people who had been managing difficulty alone for long enough that it had become simply the shape of their days. When they came over a low rise and the homestead appeared below, Luke sat up straighter in the wagon bed. It was not grand, but it was real. A solid stone and adobe house with a covered porch, a barn that looked sound, a kitchen garden enclosed in a picket fence that was in better condition than the surrounding property fence, which he could now see stretched along the southern and western edges of the land in varying states of disrepair. Several sections had posts that had simply given up their relationship with the vertical, leaning at angles that a fence post had no business leaning. In 2 places the wire was down entirely, coiled uselessly in the grass. There was a spotted dog who came running at the sound of the wagon, barking with professional commitment until Martha said, "Enough, Chester," and Chester immediately ceased barking and began wagging instead. Martha stopped the wagon at the barn. She climbed down without waiting for assistance and began unhitching the mare. Luke climbed out of the wagon bed and, after a moment's hesitation, moved to help on the other side of the harness. Martha glanced at him but did not object. "The fence on the south runs 400 yards, she said, working the buckles with practiced fingers. "The wire came down in the spring storms. I have been losing cattle through the gap and I cannot afford to lose more. The west section needs new posts in at least 6 places. The old ones have rotted at the ground." She led the mare into the barn and he followed. "There is a bunkhouse behind the main house, small, but it has a cot and a stove. You will take your meals at the house." "Yes, ma'am," Luke said. She gave the mare a bucket of water and looked at him directly for the first time since they had left town. "I am not ma'am," she said, not unkindly. "My name is Martha. You are welcome to use it." "Luke," he said. "I know," she said. "Calloway announced your name 3 times. He enjoys announcing things." She walked out of the barn and he followed again. "I will show you the bunkhouse and then show you the south section so you understand the scope of it. There is also a well that needs its rope replaced, a section of porch railing that I have been meaning to address, and the kitchen garden gate is coming off its hinges. If you finish the fence before 30 days are out, those are the next priorities." She said all of this with the efficiency of a woman who had been carrying a list in her head for some time and was now, with some relief, transferring it to another person. The bunkhouse was indeed small. It was a single room with a cot, a wood stove, a small table, a lamp, and a peg on the wall. But it was clean, the cot had a decent blanket, and it smelled of cedar and old smoke in a way that was not unpleasant. Luke had slept in considerably worse places. "There is soap and a razor on the shelf above the table," Martha said, standing in the doorway. "Dinner is at 6. Do not be late or the food will be cold and I do not reheat things." She left him then. He stood in the small room and looked around it and felt, for the first time in several weeks, something like ground under his feet. He used the soap and razor. He was late to dinner by 4 minutes because he had briefly gotten turned around finding the back door, and Martha put his plate on the table with a single look that conveyed her position on the matter clearly. The food was beans and salt pork and cornbread, and it was good, plain, honest food eaten at a table that was clean and set with care despite its simplicity. They ate mostly in silence. Not uncomfortable silence, but the silence of 2 people who did not yet have the vocabulary for each other. A lamp burned on the table between them. Through the window, the last of the sunset was going out over the western hills in a long fade of orange and red. "How long have you had this place?" Luke asked because the silence had become dense enough to seem like a choice rather than a condition. Martha looked up from her plate. 7 years, she said. My husband and I filed the claim in 1875. He died in 1878, fever. I am sorry, Luke said. So was I, she said, and returned to her food. He wanted to ask more but read correctly that this was not the moment. He finished his beans. He thanked her for the meal and meant it sincerely. She nodded and began clearing plates with the systematic efficiency that characterized everything she did. He went back to the bunkhouse and lay on the cot in the dark and listened to the nighthawks and the distant sound of coyotes and thought about the improbable series of events that had brought him to this particular cot in this particular corner of Texas. And then he stopped thinking about it because there was no useful direction for that kind of thinking, and he went asleep. He was up before dawn. He found the tool shed behind the barn and spent 20 minutes taking inventory. There was a good post hole digger, several lengths of wire, a wire stretcher that needed a new bolt but would serve, a come-along, a good mallet, an axe for trimming posts, a level, and a coil of baling wire. Whoever had last maintained this property had known what they were doing. The tools were organized and, despite some rust that wanted attention, fundamentally sound. By the time the sun cleared the eastern hills, Luke was at the south fence line with the tools loaded in a wheelbarrow, walking the full 400 yards and noting every problem. He pulled out a worn piece of paper he had found in the shed and made marks on it with a stub of pencil that had been in his shirt pocket since Abilene. He counted 8 posts that needed replacement in the south section alone, in addition to the 2 places where the wire was down. The posts that remained standing were solid enough. The wire, once restrung and properly tensioned, would hold. He was squatting at the first down section, examining the wire, when he heard footsteps and looked up to find Martha approaching with 2 tin cups of coffee. She was wearing a different dress than yesterday, this one a deeper blue-gray, with her hair pinned up in the same practical knot. She moved across the rough ground with the ease of someone who had covered it 1,000 times. She held one of the cups out to him without preamble. He took it and stood. 8 posts need replacing in this section, he said. I counted 7, she said. 3rd one from the east end, he said. It looks fine from the top, but the base is soft. It will be down before winter. She turned to look at the post in question. She was quiet for a moment. I will take your word for it, she said, which he suspected was not something she said often. I will start pulling the bad posts this morning, he said. New ones are in the wagon. I will need more than what you brought from town if I am going to do the west section too, probably another dozen. There is more lumber at Harris's mill, she said. I will go into town tomorrow. She sipped her coffee and looked at the damaged fence, and then at the land beyond it, which was flat and open and went on a very long way. There are 12 head of cattle somewhere in the southern pasture that belong to me and may or may not have drifted through this gap. One of them is a heifer I cannot afford to lose. Describe her, Luke said. Spotted black and white, broader in the shoulder than you would expect for her age, right ear notched from a barbed wire incident 2 years ago. I will look for her when I am working the south section, he said. Cattle do not go far if the grass is reasonable. Martha looked at him with a measuring expression. You know cattle, she said. It was not a question exactly, but it was waiting for confirmation. Grew up with them, he said, and I have done 3 drives. 1 up to Dodge, 2 to Abilene. He paused. I am aware that my recent record does not suggest competence, but I am actually good at this kind of work. The cards were an error in judgment that I am retiring from permanently. Something shifted at the corner of her mouth. It was not quite a smile, but it was in the same territory. Most things can be survived, she said, if the lesson takes. She took his empty cup along with hers and walked back toward the house, and Luke Boone stood in the early morning sun of a Texas August and felt something that he had not felt in a long time, which was that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The days developed a rhythm quickly. He worked the fence from dawn until the heat became serious, then took an hour's rest in the shade of the mesquite at the south end of the property, then worked again until the light went. Martha worked her own long days, tending the kitchen garden, managing the household accounts at the table in the evenings, doing the 100 small tasks that a homestead required of its sole operator. She had no hired help, had not had any since her husband died, and the scope of what she managed alone was something Luke found himself noting with increasing respect as the days passed. On the third day, he found the missing heifer. She had drifted east along a dry creek bed and was standing in a patch of bluestem grass approximately half a mile from the south fence, looking contentedly unconcerned about the anxiety she had caused. Luke spent 40 minutes working her back through terrain that did not cooperate and got her through the repaired section of fence with nothing worse than a bruised shin, where she expressed her displeasure with a well-timed kick. He came up to the house that evening with dirt on his clothes and a slight limp and told Martha at dinner. The smile came properly then, the first real one he had seen from her. It changed her face entirely, the way a window opened in a room changes it, and Luke had to look briefly at his plate because the change was more affecting than he had anticipated. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it in the way that people mean things when they have been carrying them alone for a long time and someone finally takes the weight. "She is opinionated," Luke said. "Took a swing at me when I turned her around." "She has always been like that," Martha said. "I named her Contrary when she was a calf. My husband thought it was a foolish name for a cow. He was right, but the name stuck." Luke smiled. "He sounds like a practical man." "He was," Martha said, and there was warmth in it and sadness in equal measure. "Robert Abbott was the most practical man I ever knew. He could calculate how many board feet of lumber he needed for any structure in his head. He could predict rain from cloud patterns 2 days out more reliably than any almanac, and he made the best biscuits of anyone in the county, which he never admitted to anyone because he thought it was not appropriate for a man to be known for biscuits." She paused. "He was also stubborn enough to work through a fever that any sensible person would have taken to bed for, and that is what killed him. Typhoid. It went through the water that summer and he got sick in the middle of branding season and kept working." Her voice was level, but Luke heard the thing underneath it. "I was 3 months pregnant when he died. I lost the baby 2 weeks later." The silence that followed was the kind that deserved to be honored rather than filled. Luke held it for a moment before he said, quietly, "I am sorry, Martha, truly." She met his eyes and held them for a moment with an expression that was open in a way he had not seen from her before, vulnerable without being fragile. "I am telling you this," she said, "not for sympathy but because you are going to hear things in town and I would rather you hear them from me. People have opinions about a woman running land alone. Some of those opinions are accompanied by suggestions that I should sell and go to live with my sister in San Antonio, which I have no intention of doing. This is my land. Robert and I built this together and it is mine. I have no opinion about what you should do with your land," Luke said. "Except that the west fence needs those posts before October or you will have a harder winter." The corner of her mouth moved again. "Yes," she said, "I know." He went back to the bunkhouse that night and lay on the cot, and thought about what she had told him and thought about Robert Abbott, who had been practical and good at biscuits, and dead at 30-something from a fever he had been too stubborn to rest through. And thought about the fact that this woman had held all of this alone for 4 years with no complaint that he had heard, just early mornings and long days, and a list in her head that never got shorter. He thought about her smile when he told her about the heifer. He thought about that for longer than was strictly necessary, and then told himself to go to sleep. He did not go to sleep for some time. The work on the south fence was complete by the end of the first week. He had replaced all 8 compromised posts, restrung and properly tensioned the wire, and walked every inch of it twice to confirm its soundness. Martha came out to inspect it on the 7th day, walking the full length with her hands occasionally touching the wire, testing the tension, crouching to examine the posts at ground level. "Good," she said when she had finished. "One word." But she said it the way you say something that you actually mean. "I will start on the west section tomorrow," he said. She nodded. She looked at the repaired fence and then out at the pasture where her cattle were grazing in the amber afternoon light, including Contrary, who was closest to the fence and watching them with her characteristic expression of suspicious assessment. "Why did you stay in Dust Creek?" Martha said. "After the ranching outfit you came for had folded, you could have moved on." He was quiet for a moment. He owed her honesty on this, he thought. "I was tired," he said finally. "Not physically. The other kind. I have been moving since I was 18, and I am 28 now, and I have done a lot of different things in a lot of different places, and none of them have stuck. I kept thinking the next place would be different." He paused. Dust Creek was not supposed to be a stop. I was going to stay a week, get my bearings, move on to San Antonio, but there was something about the land out here that made me slow down. I stayed longer than I meant to, and then I made some decisions that were not my best work. "The cards," she said. "The cards," he confirmed. "And the whiskey, though less of that, mostly the cards. I have what my father used to call a believing nature where cards are concerned. I always believe the next hand will be different." "Does it ever help to believe things like that?" she asked. She was not being unkind. She was genuinely asking. He thought about it. "Sometimes," he said. "The believing nature is also what made me apply for that ranching outfit when I only had an address and a third-hand recommendation, and I do not entirely regret ending up in this part of Texas." He stopped, slightly surprised at himself. He had not meant to say quite that. Martha looked at him sideways with an expression he could not fully read. The sun was going down behind the hills, and the light was doing something extraordinary to the land, pulling out all the gold in the grass and the red in the limestone, and Martha Abbott standing in it with one hand still resting lightly on his fence post looked like something you would carry in your memory. "Come eat," she said, and turned back toward the house. He followed her. On the 9th day, trouble came from the east. It came in the shape of 2 riders from the Hargrove outfit, which was the largest cattle operation in the county, and which had, according to various things Luke had pieced together from listening carefully in town, when he had gone in with Martha for lumber, been attempting to acquire or otherwise pressure out the smaller homesteaders along the southern range for the past 3 years. Hargrove's main foreman, a wide-bodied, flat-faced man named Cutter Danby, was the delivery mechanism for most of this pressure. Luke was working the west fence and saw them coming from a distance, and something in the way they rode made him put down his tools and stand up straight. He was 100 yards from the house, which put him between the riders and Martha, which was where he preferred to be. Martha had seen them too. She came out onto the porch and stood with her arms at her sides and her face set in the expression Luke had come to recognize as her working face, the one that showed nothing she did not intend. Danby pulled up at the edge of the yard, his companion hanging back a few feet. Danby was the kind of man who used the height of a horse to make himself seem larger than he was, and he wore a pistol with the comfort of someone who had used it, though not, Luke suspected, in any formal contest. "Morning, Mrs. Abbott," Danby said, with the surface manners of a man who had learned courtesy as a tool rather than a habit. "Mr. Hargrove asked me to come by with a revised offer on your property. Considering the expense of maintaining the place, he thought you might appreciate another opportunity to discuss terms." "I have given Mr. Hargrove my position on terms," Martha said evenly. "It has not changed." Danby's eyes moved to Luke, who had walked up from the fence line and was now standing at the edge of the yard with his arms loose at his sides, watching. "You hire on help," Danby said. "I have a fence contractor," Martha said, and the word contractor was delivered with a composure that was, Luke thought, genuinely impressive. "Funny kind of fence contractor for a place this size," Danby said. He looked at Luke with the specific assessment of a man deciding whether something would be a problem. "You are new in these parts," he said. "I am," Luke said pleasantly. "Passing through." "Not at the moment," Luke said. Danby looked back at Martha. "Mrs. Abbott, Mr. Hargrove is prepared to be generous. This property is a lot for one woman to manage." "I am managing it," Martha said. "You had cattle out last week," Danby said. "Through the south fence. We moved them back." Luke saw Martha's jaw tighten slightly at this. "My fence is repaired," she said. "This time," Danby said. He let that sit for a moment. "Things break down out here. It is a hard country for someone alone." "She is not alone," Luke said. He said it quietly, not aggressively, but with a flat certainty that carried across the morning air clearly. Danby looked at him again, this time with more focus. The silence held for a few seconds. Then Danby tipped his hat at Martha with the false courtesy and turned his horse. "We will pass Mr. Hargrove's message along," he said. "Good day, Mrs. Abbott." They rode back the way they had come. Luke watched them until they were over the hill, then looked at Martha. She was watching them too, her arms still at her sides. "He has been by 4 times this year," she said. "Twice with offers, twice with observations about how difficult things were and how it might be easier elsewhere." Her voice was steady, but he heard the weight in it. "The offer is not fair. The land is worth twice what Hargrove has put on it, but that is not even the reason. This land is mine." "I know," Luke said. "Thank you," she said, and it was the same as when he had brought back the heifer, that particular quality of thanks that comes from someone who has been fighting alone and has briefly, unexpectedly, not had to. He went back to his fence. In the second week, the work on the west fence settled into a satisfying pattern that Luke found himself looking forward to each morning. There was something deeply clarifying about work that had clear parameters and visible results, where you could see each morning what had been accomplished and measure the day's progress in physical terms. The blisters on his hands from the wire work had graduated to calluses. His back, which had complained for the first few days about posture he had not used in a while, had stopped complaining. He was sleeping better than he had in months. He also found, increasingly, that he was looking forward to the meals. Not only the food, though the food was genuinely good and Martha Abbott cooked with the same focused competence she brought to everything else. But the conversation had opened up over the 2 weeks slowly, the way a window opens that has been painted shut, with effort at first and then with increasing ease. They talked about the ranch, about cattle and weather, and the various small crises and satisfactions of working land. But they also talked about other things. She had grown up in Missouri, she told him one evening, the youngest of 4 children on a farm outside of Springfield. Her father had been a schoolteacher as well as a farmer, which was not unusual in Missouri in the 1860s, and she had learned to read early and well, and considered it one of the few advantages she had. She had a small shelf of books above the fireplace in the main room. A Bible, a copy of Great Expectations she had read so many times the spine had been repaired with a strip of leather, a farmer's almanac, a book on cattle diseases, and a thin volume of poetry by someone Luke had not heard of that she said had been her mother's. "Do you read?" she asked him. "Slowly," he said. "But yes, my mother taught me. She had come out from Virginia and she had strong opinions about reading." He paused. "She also had strong opinions about card playing, which she had communicated clearly and which I had failed to benefit from." Martha gave him the small, almost smile. "What was she like, your mother?" He thought about this with more care than he usually applied to personal questions. "Small," he said. "In size, not in any other way. She kept geraniums in pots on the windowsill even when times were lean, and there was no money for anything that did not have a direct practical function, and she would have told you that geraniums were a direct practical function because they reminded her that the world had more in it than cattle prices and dry weather. She died when I was 14. Pneumonia." He was quiet for a moment. "I still think of her when I see geraniums." Martha looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not pity but was something careful and attentive. "I am sorry," she said. "She was a good woman," he said simply. The silence that followed was comfortable. Outside, a night bird was saying something in the dark, and the lamp on the table between them made a small, warm circle against the August night. "Luke," Martha said. "Yes." She was looking at her hands, which were folded on the table. "When your 30 days are done, what are you planning to do?" He looked at her. "I have not entirely decided," he said. She raised her eyes to his. "There is work here," she said carefully. "Ongoing work." I cannot pay much, but I can pay something, and there is the room in the bunkhouse." She paused. "I am not in the habit of asking people for things, but you work hard and you are honest, and the property needs more attention than I can give it alone." He held her gaze and understood that this was considerably harder for her to say than it was making it appear. "I will stay," he said. Something in her shoulders released, almost imperceptibly. "Good," she said, in exactly the same tone she had used when she inspected the south fence. "That is settled then." He went back to the bunkhouse that night with a feeling in his chest that he identified, after some consideration, as something in the neighborhood of happiness. In the third week, the well rope was replaced, the porch railing was repaired, the kitchen garden gate was rehung on new hinges, and Luke also took it upon himself, without being asked, to repair the weatherboarding on the north side of the barn where two boards had split and were letting in weather. He found the lumber in the barn's own storage, correctly sized, and used the remaining afternoon light to complete the repair. He did not mention it to Martha. She noticed it the next morning when she went to do the milking and came back to the house with an expression he had not seen before, a kind of unguarded warmth that lasted all through breakfast. It was during the third week that they also began to talk about harder things. He told her about his father, who had been a good man with cattle and a poor man with money, and who had died when Luke was 23, leaving a property that was more debt than asset. He told her about the 3 cattle drives, about what it was like to spend months on the open range, sleeping under stars and eating dust, and the strange mixture of freedom and loneliness that came with it. He told her about the letter from the ranching outfit, how he had come to Dust Creek full of plans that had not materialized, and the slide into the saloon that had followed. "I'm not usually that man," he said, referring to the man who had been standing on the stage. "I mean, I have been that man, but it is not who I intend to be." "I know," she said. "A man's worst week is not usually his full story." "What made you bid?" he asked. He had wondered this since the moment it happened. She was quiet for a moment. "I had been in town to buy the fence posts and nails," she said. "I knew about the auction because Dust Creek is not a large place and things get known. I had heard Calloway talking about it in the general store 2 days earlier. He was quite proud of the idea, a small contemptuous breath. I did not go to town intending to bid. I went to buy supplies. But I needed the fence fixed, and I had been trying to find someone reliable for 3 months and failing, and there you were." She paused. "I also did not think it was right, the auction. A man should not be sold for a bar debt in a public square. It was a small injustice in the scheme of things, but injustice has a way of becoming large when it goes unchallenged." Luke looked at her. "You paid $42 to correct an injustice and fix a fence," he said. "I paid $42 to fix a fence," she said. "The injustice correction was an ancillary benefit." He laughed. "A real one, full and genuine," and Martha Abbott looked at him with an expression that he saw very clearly, and that did things to his composure that he was not prepared for. They were sitting on the porch after dinner. The evening was cooling from its daytime extremity, and the sky to the west was going through its nightly performance of impossible colors. Chester the dog was asleep across Martha's boots with the boneless abandon of a dog who trusted his circumstances completely. "Martha," Luke said. "Yes," she said. She was looking at the sunset, her profile clean and serious against the fading light. "I want to say something, and I want to say it plainly because I think you are a person who prefers plain speaking." She turned to look at him. Her expression was waiting and open in a way that cost her something. He could see that it cost her. "I have not been particularly good at recognizing things that matter when I am in the middle of them," he said. "I tend to recognize them after. But I am trying to do better at that, and in the interest of doing better at it, I want to tell you that I think you are remarkable. Not in a way that is about the fence or the house or any of that. In a way that is about you. I am aware that I am a man who was auctioned off for a bar debt 3 weeks ago and that my standing to say anything of this nature is limited, but I told myself I was done being a coward about the things that actually matter, so." He stopped. Martha was very still. "So," she said slowly. "So I have told you," he said. You do not have to say anything. I will still fix the fence. I will still stay for the ongoing work. Whatever you want to do with what I have said is your business entirely." Martha looked at him for a long moment with her brown eyes, which had in 3 weeks shown him a range of things, precision and warmth and grief and humor, and now something that was very clear and very quiet, and that made his heart do things it had not done in a long time. "I think," she said carefully, "that I have been telling myself that I was not looking at you as anything other than a fence contractor. Since approximately the 3rd day." She paused. "I was wrong about that." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from all the ones that had come before it. Chester shifted in his sleep across Martha's boots and made a small, contented sound. Luke reached out and covered her hand with his, where it rested on the arm of the porch chair. She turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that as the sun finished going down and the stars came out over the Texas hills, and neither of them needed to say anything else because everything that needed to be said had been said, and everything that needed to be felt was being felt, and that was, for the moment, exactly enough. The next morning had a different quality to it. Not dramatic, not transformed, but altered in the way that things alter when something real has been established between two people, a kind of warmth that ran underneath the ordinary transactions of the day, present in the way she handed him his coffee, in the way he caught her eye across the kitchen garden, and she looked away with something on her face that was not quite the small, almost smile, but was related to it, and considerably more affecting. He finished the west fence on the 23rd day. He walked it with Martha in the early morning the way she had walked the south section, and she ran her hand along the wire and tested the posts and looked at each replaced section with her honest appraiser's eye. "This is good work," she said. "The whole property is good work," he said. "It was Robert Abbott who built the bones of it. I just maintained them." She was quiet for a moment at that. "He would have been glad to know it was kept up," she said. "I think he knew it would be," Luke said. "He chose well when he built this life." Martha looked at him sideways. There was color in her face that was not entirely attributable to the morning sun. In the final week of his original 30 days, Luke went into Dust Creek with Martha to settle the matter formally. Calloway's expression when they walked into his saloon together was gratifying in a way that Luke allowed himself to enjoy briefly. The arrangement was declared concluded. Deputy Hicks stamped a piece of paper. Calloway suggested a drink to mark the occasion. Neither of them accepted. Outside on the main street of Dust Creek in the late afternoon heat, Martha looked at the paper Hicks had given her and folded it into her pocket. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. "You are a free man," she said, with a tone that he could not entirely read. "I made an agreement to stay on," he said. "I intend to keep it." "Agreements can be renegotiated," she said. "Circumstances change." "My circumstances have not changed," he said. "They have, if anything, improved considerably since 3 weeks ago. I have steady work, a sound roof, good food, and company I prefer to any I have had in 10 years. He looked at her directly. "I am not going anywhere, Martha." She held his gaze for a moment and then looked away down the street with the expression of a woman who has been on her own long enough that the idea of not being on her own requires some internal rearrangement. "All right," she said, and there was nothing in those 2 words that was small. They went to the general store for the monthly supplies, and while they were there, the storekeeper's wife, Mrs. Oberg, gave Martha a long measuring look and told her that it was good to see her looking well and that she appeared to have found reliable help, which she said in a tone that clearly indicated she meant something else entirely. Martha thanked her for the observation with a composure that Luke admired enormously. On the drive home, Martha was quiet for a few miles. Then she said, "People will talk." "People in small towns talk about everything," Luke said. "It is their primary form of entertainment. I do not see how what they say about us is more important than what we know to be true." "It is not," she said. "I just want you to know that I am aware of it. I have been the subject of talk before and I have survived it." "I do not doubt it," he said. She glanced at him. "You are a very calm person," she said. "I was not 3 weeks ago," he said. "I was about as uncalm as a man can be while technically standing still. but I have found that things that are actually right have a settling effect. This time the smile came fully and without the usual restraint, and it lit her face from the inside in a way that Luke filed away, as one of the things he intended to see as many times as possible for the rest of his available life. The autumn came on early that year, the nights cooling fast in September, and with it came a new season of demands on the property. There was wood to be cut and stacked, the kitchen garden to be put to bed for the winter, the barn to be made tight for cold weather, and the cattle to be assessed and sorted before the market trip to Abilene. Luke threw himself into all of it with the focused energy of a man who has found his purpose after a long search and does not intend to squander it. He also made biscuits one morning in early September, because he had been thinking about Robert Abbott's biscuits and had a technique from his mother that he had not used in years, and he put them on the table before Martha came in for breakfast. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the biscuits and then looked at him with an expression that flickered between surprise and something else. "Did you make those?" she said. "My mother's recipe," he said. "More or less. I may have gotten the amount of lard slightly wrong." She sat down and tried one and was quiet for a moment. "They are very good," she said. "I will make them when I have time," he said. "It is nothing." "It is not nothing," she said quietly. He looked up. She was looking at the biscuit in her hand with an expression he understood. He did not say anything because there are moments when words would be smaller than the silence, and this was one of them. 3 weeks into September, with the days shortening and the heat finally relenting into the long golden warmth of Texas autumn, Cutter Danby came back. This time he came alone, and he came to the fence line where Luke was doing supplementary maintenance on the northeast corner, and he got down off his horse. "Hargrove wants to make a final offer," Danby said. He was not hostile this time, just flat, which was in some ways more concerning. "Real money, enough for the widow to set up comfortable elsewhere." "Mrs. Abbott is not interested," Luke said. He kept working, bending a new staple over the wire. "She have not heard the number," Danby said. "She has given her position," Luke said. "Multiple times. If Hargrove has trouble with the word no, I am not sure a higher number is going to help the situation." Danby looked at him for a long moment. "You have a stake in this," he said. "I work here," Luke said. "That all?" Luke straightened up and looked at him. "No," he said, "that is not all." Danby studied him with the calculating eyes of a man working out odds. Then he picked up his reins. "Hargrove does not give up easy," he said. "Neither does she," Luke said. Danby rode away. Luke watched him go and felt a cold certainty settle in him about the nature of what Hargrove was prepared to do to get this land, and that evening at dinner he told Martha plainly. "I know," she said. She was not surprised. "He has been trying since 1880. He has made 3 homesteaders along the South Range sell. The Riley family, the Coopers, and old Tom Weaver." She folded her hands on the table. "He cannot force me out legally. I have the deed and the claim, and I have never missed a payment. All he can do is make it difficult." "What kind of difficult?" Luke said. She met his eyes steadily. "Last winter someone cut my south fence twice, before I had you here to fix it. I lost 4 head of cattle through the gap and could not prove who had done it." Her jaw was set. "I do not have proof. But I have a considered opinion." Luke was quiet for a moment, the anger in him controlled but present. "We need to document things," he said. "Every interaction, every visit, every instance of damage. If it comes to a legal matter, documented history matters." "Where did you learn about legal matters?" she asked, surprised. "My father had a dispute with a neighboring rancher for 6 years," he said. "We lost, but I learned from it. In this country right now, in 1882, the law is slow to take the side of the small landowner, but it is there if you know how to use it. And there are lawyers in Abilene who handle land disputes and who are not in the pocket of the big ranching outfits." Martha looked at him with the same expression she had turned on him when he had identified the 3rd fence post, the one she had counted as fine. "All right," she said. "We document." "We document," he confirmed. That word, "we," sat on the table between them like something solid. The cattle drive to Abilene in early October was something they planned together over several evenings, with Martha's account spread on the table and the two of them working through the numbers with the focused partnership of people who have learned each other's rhythms. She knew the cattle markets, knew the buyers, knew which stock to sell and which to keep. He knew the practical logistics of moving cattle, the route, the timing, the risks. Together they put together a plan that was considerably better than either would have made alone. They drove 10 head to Abilene over 3 days, with Chester doing more than his share of the herding work, and conducting himself throughout with the self-satisfaction of a dog who knew his skills were being properly employed. The drive was warm and dusty, and involved one river crossing that was more dramatic than intended, and a night on the open range under a sky so full of stars that Martha sat up in her blankets and looked at it for 20 minutes without saying anything. "Does it bother you?" she said finally, being outside, sleeping rough. "No," he said honestly. He was lying on his back with his hat over his face. "I think I was made for it, actually. The wide country, big sky." He paused. "The right company makes it considerably better." She was quiet for a moment. "Luke, yes, I want to tell you something." He moved his hat and looked at her in the starlight. She was sitting with her blanket around her shoulders, her hair loose for once, which he had not seen before, and the moonlight was doing something remarkable with the red in it. "I was afraid," she said. "For a long time after Robert died, I was afraid of everything, though I did not let anyone see it. Afraid of the property failing, afraid of the winters alone, afraid of Hargrove, afraid of getting sick with no one to help." She paused. "I became very good at not being afraid in a way that anyone could see. I became good at the face I show people." She looked at him. "I find that I do not put that face on around you. I'm not entirely sure when it stopped being necessary." He sat up. The fire they had made was low, casting just enough light. "Martha," he said, "I am not saying it to be distressing," she said. "I am saying it because I think you should know." She paused. "You said you were trying to be less of a coward about the things that matter. I am also trying." He moved to sit beside her and she turned toward him, and for a moment they were very close, close enough that he could see the details of her face clearly in the fire's last light. The fine lines at the corners of her eyes that were made by years of squinting into the Texas sun, the particular shape of her mouth when it was being honest rather than composed. He kissed her. She kissed him back. Not tentatively, but with the same directness she brought to everything, and the Texas night surrounded them with its stars and its silences and its vast dark distances, and Chester the dog was asleep nearby and did not comment. After a while she put her head against his shoulder and he put his arm around her and they sat by the dying fire, and the stars turned overhead with the unhurried rotation of the world going on with its business. "I have been thinking," he said eventually. "That can be dangerous," she said, and he could hear the smile in it. "I have been thinking about what I want," he said, "which is a thing I have not thought about very clearly for a long time. I have been thinking about what it would mean to stop moving and to stay somewhere because you want to be there rather than because you have not decided to go yet." He paused. "I am telling you this because I want you to know that this is not a temporary thing for me. This is not me still passing through Dust Creek on the way to San Antonio. I want to be here. I want to be here with you." Martha was quiet for a long moment. Her hand was on his chest over the buttons of his shirt. "I know," she said. "I know it is not temporary. I have known that since about the 4th day, if I am being truthful." "The 4th day," he said. "When I fixed the 3rd fence post that you thought was fine." "Yes," she said, and laughed, which was a sound he intended to arrange to hear as often as possible, a real laugh, uncalculated and warm. "They sold the 10 head in Abilene to a buyer Martha had dealt with before, a round, businesslike man named Ketterman, and got a fair price. Fair enough that on the way back, Martha allowed herself a kind of quiet satisfaction that Luke had come to recognize as the closest she got to celebration in public. She spent an afternoon in Abilene at a lawyer's office, a young man named Harris who had been recommended to her, and Luke waited outside and watched the street traffic and felt the particular calm of a man who knows where his next day is going. When she came out, she said, "He thinks we have a case against Hargrove if we can document the fence cutting. He says there is a land harassment statute that was used successfully in a case in Dallas last year." She paused. "He also says that having a husband on the deed would complicate any further acquisition attempts Hargrove might make, because it adds a second legal party to dispute." Luke looked at her. She was looking at a point somewhere past his shoulder, her chin at the angle he recognized as "I have said the difficult thing, and now I am waiting." "Is that a suggestion?" he said. She looked at him directly then. "It is information," she said, "relevant information." "Martha," he said. "Luke," she said, "are you asking me to marry you for legal complications?" The small smile. "Among other reasons," she said, and in Martha Abbott's vocabulary among other reasons meant everything else that had been building between them for 3 months. Every meal shared, every fence post set, every conversation at the end of a long day, every held hand, every kiss, every night on the open range under the enormous Texas sky. "Yes," he said. "Yes, what?" she said. "Yes to every reason," he said. "All of them, especially the legal ones." She made a sound that was half laugh and half something more tender, and he pulled her to him right there on the main street of Abilene in October of 1882 and kissed her. And 2 men walking past tipped their hats in what might have been congratulation and walked on. They married in November, at the small Baptist church in Dusk Creek, in front of most of the town, including the storekeeper's wife, Mrs. Oberg, who wept in a way that managed to imply she had seen this coming from the beginning. The minister was a soft-spoken man named Reverend Price, who asked the questions of the ceremony with genuine warmth, and performed the rites with the particular care of someone who had presided over enough funerals to understand what a wedding meant. Martha wore a dress she had made herself from fabric brought from Abilene, a deep ivory cotton with a lace collar that had belonged to her mother. She wore her hair down for the occasion, and Luke looked at her when she came to stand beside him at the front of the church, and felt the particular vertigo of understanding that something in his life had become irrevocably and correctly larger. He had found a second-hand suit in Abilene that fit well enough, and had borrowed a tie from Reverend Price's collection. He did not have a ring. They had discussed this practically, and Martha had said she did not need one. He had promised her one by spring when the finances were steadier, and she had said that was fine, but she was not holding him to it. He had already ordered it from the jeweler in Abilene and paid for it in installments from his wages, but that was a separate matter. After the ceremony, there was a small gathering at the church hall, with food brought by the congregation in the way of small towns, and Chester had somehow gotten in through a side door and was circulating among the guests with the focused purpose of a dog at a food-adjacent event. Harlan Calloway attended, which surprised Luke, until he remembered that Dusk Creek was not a large town. Calloway shook his hand with the expression of a man acknowledging that things had not gone the way he had expected. "I see you landed well," Calloway said. "I did," Luke said, and meant it in every possible sense. Deputy Hicks attended and made a small speech that was better than expected. The storekeeper's wife cried again. The boy from the auction, whose name turned out to be Jesse and who was the son of the blacksmith, sat in the corner and ate an extraordinary amount of cake with the focused dedication he had previously applied to the peach. Martha stood beside Luke through all of it with her hand in the crook of his arm, and her face open and warm in a way that the town of Dusk Creek, which had known her for 7 years, had possibly never seen before. And the quality of the warmth in that church hall on that November afternoon was such that even the most skeptical of the assembled townspeople left it feeling better about the general state of things. That winter was a good winter, which is to say it was not an easy winter, but it was a full one. The cold settled in hard in December, and the work changed its character, becoming about maintenance and warmth and preparation rather than the outward-facing labor of the growing season. They worked side by side in the barn on bitter mornings, the steam of their breath rising together in the cold air, taking care of the animals with the unhurried efficiency of people who have divided the labor and trust each other to do their part. The evenings were long and close, and theirs. Martha read by the fire while Luke worked on the harness that needed new stitching, and they talked or did not talk as the evening required, and the lamp burned low, and the wood stove ticked, and Chester slept in front of it and occasionally kicked in his sleep after some dream rabbit. Luke put the ring on Martha's finger on Christmas Day. He had wrapped it in a handkerchief and set it beside her coffee cup at breakfast, and when she opened it and saw the simple gold band, she looked up at him with an expression that was entirely unguarded, all the composure she had built over years of managing alone entirely absent, and her eyes were bright in a way that he was not going to describe as anything other than what it was. "You ordered this from Abilene," she said. "In September," he said. She turned the ring in the light and then held her hand out to him, and he put it on her finger, which was where it belonged. She held her hand up and looked at it for a long moment. Then she got up and came around the table and put her arms around him, and held on with the full strength of someone who had been keeping everything together alone for a long time and had found, at last, something worth letting it down for. In January, Hargrove made one more attempt. Not Danby this time, but Hargrove himself, who turned out to be a smaller man than his reputation suggested, with careful eyes, and a lawyer from San Antonio who arrived in a buckboard. They came with a revised offer that was, as Hargrove presented it, final and extremely generous. Luke and Martha received them in the main room of the house, sitting side by side at the table as the two men sat across from them, and Martha listened to the entire presentation with complete courtesy and complete composure, and then said, "My answer is no. My husband's answer is no. This conversation has happened many times, and this will be the last time. The next approach will be answered by the letter of the law, which I have been advised on and which has relevant things to say about land harassment and property rights." She paused. "I appreciate you coming in person, Mr. Hargrove. It must have been a long drive." Hargrove looked at her for a long moment and then looked at Luke with the eyes of a man reassessing a calculation. "You have a determined wife," he said. "I know," Luke said. "Determined enough that there is nothing to be done, I suppose," Hargrove said. He stood and picked up his hat. "I do not offer 3 times," he said, which appeared to be intended as a warning but came out more like a concession. "We know," Martha said. "Good day." They watched the buckboard leave from the porch. When it had gone over the south hill and out of sight, Martha let out a long, slow breath, and Luke looked at her profile, the set of her jaw relaxing at last, and felt the kind of anger and pride in combination that you feel when someone you love has been put upon and has refused to be moved. "Done," she said. "Done," he agreed. She turned and looked at him, and then looked at the land spreading out in every direction from their porch, the dry winter grass, the fence lines holding solid, the hills going blue in the distance, and said nothing for a moment, because sometimes the best thing to say is nothing. "Robert would have liked you," she said eventually. He put his arm around her shoulders. "I hope so," he said. "He would have had a great many practical observations about your fence work," she said. "I expect they would have been fair," Luke said. She laughed. He held her closer, and they stood on the porch of the house she had built with her first husband and was now building a different life in with her second, and the winter sun was thin and cold and very bright, and the land was theirs. Spring came with the particular Texas extravagance of bluebonnets and warm wind, and the sudden return of everything that had been patient through the cold. The cattle that had been kept through winter were in good condition, considerably better than the previous year, and there were new calves, including one from Contrary, who had produced, in the way of all her opinions, a calf that was louder and more opinionated than seemed strictly necessary. Martha told him she was expecting a child in March. She told him at breakfast. In the straightforward way she told him most things, looking at him across the table with her honest brown eyes and a composure that he knew was covering a certain amount of vulnerability, because this was not a straightforward thing for her. This was a thing that connected to grief and loss and the particular courage of hoping again after a hope had been destroyed. He was quiet for a moment, understanding all of that. Then he said, "How are you feeling?" "Frightened," she said, which from Martha Abbott was not a small admission, "and glad both at once." "Yes," he said, "both make sense." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. She turned her hand over and held on. "We will be careful," he said. "We will do everything right, and whatever happens, I am here." "I know," she said, and the way she said it was different from all the other times she had said it over the past months. It was not just acknowledgement now. It was belief. The pregnancy went well. Martha, being Martha, refused to slow down at speeds that alarmed Luke on regular occasions. But she also, quietly, made the concessions that needed making, allowing him to take over the heavier barn work without argument, eating more than she usually allowed herself, resting in the afternoons with a book in a way that she had clearly decided to frame as productivity rather than rest. He built a cradle in June in the evenings, with pine from Harris's mill, and a level of care that he had not previously applied to any piece of woodworking. It took 3 weeks and several restarts, and he was more nervous about it than about any fence he had ever built, because a fence was just property and this was something else entirely. When he brought it into the house and set it in the corner of the bedroom, Martha came and looked at it with her appraiser's eye and said nothing for a long time. "Well," he said, "it is the finest thing in this house," she said, which was not objectively true, given that the house was sound and well-made. But he understood what she meant, and felt it settle in his chest like something that would be there for a very long time. Their son was born in November of 1883, on a Tuesday morning with the help of Mrs. Oberg, who turned out to have delivered a considerable number of babies in her time, and had strong opinions about how to run a birthing room that Luke experienced from the hallway. While the door was closed, and Chester sat beside him and looked up at him with an expression of what appeared to be solidarity. The baby was named Robert Luke Abbott Boone, which Martha decided on with the same directness she brought to all her decisions, and when she said the name aloud for the first time, Luke understood what she was doing and what it meant, and did not trust himself to speak for a moment. He was red-faced and loud, and had, within the first 10 minutes of his existence, communicated clearly that he was going to have opinions about things. Chester inspected him with the cautious thoroughness of a dog who understood that something important had occurred and would require monitoring. Luke held his son on the first night, sitting in the chair by the bedroom window while Martha slept, the baby wrapped in a blue blanket that Mrs. Oberg had brought as a gift, and looked at this small creature who was both entirely new and somehow already full of some particular self, and felt the weight of it in the best possible sense, the weight of something real and permanent and worth everything it would require. Outside, the November stars were brilliant over the Texas hills, the same stars under which he had arrived in Dusk Creek with $60 and bad intentions regarding cards, the same stars under which he had stood on a stage with his wrists tied while the town decided what to do with him. The distance between that man and this one felt enormous and also, strangely, entirely logical, as though every failed plan and poor decision had been pointing here without his understanding. Martha opened her eyes in the dimness. "Is he sleeping?" she asked. "For the moment," he said. "That will not last," she said. "No," he agreed. She turned to look at him in the chair with the baby, and her face had in it everything she was, the toughness and the warmth, the grief she had survived, the love she had permitted herself again, the deep competence of a woman who had built a life through sheer refusal to stop. "Come to bed," she said. "He will wake you soon enough." He laid the baby carefully in the cradle he had built. The cradle held. He climbed into bed beside Martha, and she turned toward him, and he put his arm around her. And outside, the November wind moved across the land that was theirs, rustling the dry grass along the fence lines that stood solid against whatever came, and the stars wheeled over the Texas hills in the enormous dark. and in the house that had been built by Robert Abbott and was being built differently now by the people who carried his name and his love forward into the future. Everyone who needed to be sleeping was sleeping, and everything that needed to be whole was whole. The following spring came in warm and early, bringing the bluebonnets back in waves across the hills around the property. Young Robert, who had spent his first winter becoming a person with clear preferences and a vocal approach to expressing them, was by April a round, serious-eyed baby who had discovered the compelling nature of Chester's ears and spent considerable time investigating them. Chester accepted this with the long-suffering dignity of a dog who had decided that his role in life was to be accommodating. The property itself had grown into something that Luke was genuinely proud of, the kind of pride that has nothing to do with showing off and everything to do with the satisfaction of work done honestly over time. The fences were sound. The barn was solid. The cattle herd, carefully managed through 2 seasons now, had grown to 30 head and was beginning to look like a real operation. Martha's kitchen garden had expanded to include 2 cold frames she and Luke had built together along the south side of the house, extending the growing season by a month on each end. They had also, in the spring of 1884, taken on a piece of land adjacent to the southeast corner of the property, a homestead claim that had been abandoned by the Cooper family when they sold to Hargrove, but which the county records showed had not been properly incorporated into Hargrove's deed. Martha had found this detail in the county records on one of her trips to Dust Creek with the focused, investigative quality she brought to all administrative matters, and the young lawyer Harris had confirmed it and helped them file the claim. Hargrove had protested, but the documentation had been exactly as Martha presented it, and in the end the land was theirs. Luke went to fence the new section in April, taking 3 days to do it properly, and on the evening of the first day he made camp near the dry creek bed that ran along the eastern edge of the new section, made a fire, and looked up at the stars and thought about the chain of events that had delivered him to this piece of ground. $42.30, a broken mirror and several weeks of whiskey and cards. A woman with a practical purse and a list in her head and brown eyes that assessed things honestly. A fence that needed fixing. He thought about the stage outside Calloway's saloon and the boy with the peach and Martha Abbott standing at the back of the crowd, taking her hat off. He thought about the way she had looked at him on the stage, checking for defects, and about the question she had asked that was the most practical and also, it turned out, the most important question he had ever been asked. Can you fix a fence? He could. He had. He was still fixing things and building things, and he intended to do so for a very long time. He was back at the homestead on the 3rd evening, coming over the south rise in the last of the day's light, with the tools in the wagon and the new fence behind him completed and sound. He could see the lamp already lit in the kitchen window, the warm yellow rectangle of it across the darkening yard, and he could see Martha's figure moving inside it. And Chester came running from the direction of the barn with his ears up and his tail going. And from inside the house came, briefly, the sound of young Robert's voice expressing some opinion about the evening. Luke stopped the wagon at the barn and unhitched the gray mare, who had been replaced last summer by a younger animal, a chestnut gelding named Prospect, who was brighter in temperament but less reliable about puddles. He settled the horse and put the tools away and walked to the house and came in through the back door into the kitchen, where Martha was at the stove with Robert on her hip, both of them considering something cooking in the pot. She turned when he came in, and Robert immediately reached for him with the imperious certainty of a baby who is accustomed to being taken. Luke took him, and Robert grabbed his collar with both hands and gazed at him with the large, serious eyes he had from Martha. "Fence done," Martha said. "Fence done," he said. "All 460 yards. Post and wire 4 strands, 16-inch spacing. Sound as anything on the property." She looked at him with the assessment that he still loved after 2 years of receiving it, the checking for defects look that had become over time also a look of warmth and recognition, and a kind of belonging that he had not known he was looking for before he found it. "Good," she said, in the way she said it when she meant all of it. He sat down at the table with Robert in his lap and watched her finish the evening meal and listened to the sounds of the house around them, and felt the particular fullness of a life that was exactly what it should be. Not easy, not without difficulty, but real and earned and entirely, permanently his. They ate dinner together in the kitchen with the lamp burning between them as it had every evening since the autumn he had arrived, and Robert sat in the wooden high chair that Luke had built the previous winter, eating mashed beans with the focused application of someone for whom this was still a fairly new technology, and Chester was in his place by the stove, and the night was warm outside, and the fence lines of the Abbott Boone homestead stood solid in the dark against the wide Texas plain. Martha poured coffee after dinner, and they sat across from each other with the easy quiet between them that was the best kind of quiet, the kind built from time and trust and the accumulated weight of ordinary days that had been good because they had been shared. "I have been thinking," she said. "That can be dangerous," he said. She gave him the look. "I have been thinking about the Cooper section," she said. "With 40 acres more, if we managed carefully, we could keep more cattle and also perhaps think about expanding the garden operation. There is a market for preserved goods in Dust Creek. Mrs. Oberg mentioned it." She paused. "And I have been thinking that we may need to consider help again eventually, when the children are older." "Children," he said, with a slight emphasis on the plural. She held her coffee cup and looked at him with the completely composed expression she used when she had said something deliberately. "That is also something I have been thinking about," she said, "if you have no objection." He looked at her across the table in the lamplight. In the house on the land they had both fought for and fixed and made into something worth keeping, with their son in his high chair conducting a complex investigation of the wooden surface in front of him, and Chester asleep in the firelight, and the Texas dark outside full of stars and space, and the future going out in all directions with its possibilities and its work and its grace. "I have no objection," he said. "I have no objection to any of it. Whatever you are planning, Martha, I am in." She smiled, the full one, the real one, and it was still and would always be the finest thing he had ever seen. He reached across the table, and she met him halfway, her hand in his the way it had been on the porch that first evening, and on the cattle drive under the stars, and at the church in Dust Creek, and every day since, in all the small transactions of a life being built by two people who had found each other at the intersection of a bar debt and a broken fence, and had understood, slowly and then completely, that this was where they were supposed to be. Outside, the night wind moved across the property, through the bluebonnets coming in on the south rise, along the fence line standing straight and true, over the cattle settled in the spring pasture, across the kitchen garden with its cold frames and its careful rows, past the barn and the bunkhouse and the well with its new rope, and up against the walls of the house where the lamp burned in the window and the people inside it were, all of them, exactly home.